so much, Kit. You're going to stand right here next to me. Thank you so much, Kit Evans-Ford. Welcome, dear friends, and with Kit, I want to welcome everyone and invite you to have a wonderful conference. We're so excited about this. We've been planning this evening for a year, and I hope you have a powerful day again on Sunday at Los Alamos like we did yesterday. And enter into the spirit of nonviolence and peace here tonight. And just to say, for the record, as we start, you know, it's a terrible time in the world in terms of ongoing war, drone attacks. You know all of this. Police killings, mass incarceration, racism, the Charleston killings, extreme poverty, 1 billion malnourished, nuclear weapons, corporate greed, environmental destruction, the systems of violence around us, the roots of violence within us. We remember tonight what our leader, Reverend Martin Luther King, said on April 3rd, 1968. The choice is no longer violence or nonviolence. That's not what we're talking about. It's nonviolence or non-existence. With that in mind, we at Bene consciously, a few years ago with Kit, decided to organize Campaign Nonviolence as a grassroots national movement, as Ken says, to connect the dots between all these issues of violence and to pursue Dr. King's vision of the coming of a new culture of nonviolence. So last September 2014, during the week of International Peace Day, September 21st, we organized over 250 demonstrations on all the issues in all 50 states against all these forms of violence and for the coming of a new culture of nonviolence. You can read more about it in the packet. It was very, very exciting. We're going to do it all again this September. We already have 150 planned in all 50 states beginning September 20th. It's very exciting. And I invite everyone here to consider going, when you go home, you'll hear more about it this weekend, to plan an action in your community and to register with us and to keep helping us build this new kind of movement. Well, as we're trying to build a new grassroots movement of nonviolence, we said, let's have a conference in Santa Fe and bring together the best teachers of nonviolence and peace and justice activists in the nation. Isn't that exciting? Well, you know I'm a little over the top. We decided to dare think of this as the first national conference on nonviolence in the U.S. I don't know. If you're going to have a national conference on nonviolence, there's only one person in the nation, and maybe the world, who could start us off and be with us throughout this time. And it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce and welcome our keynote speaker. His friend, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., called our speaker the leading theorist and strategist of nonviolence in the world. He's been my friend and teacher for 25 years. We met in jail 25 years ago after a protest against U.S. military aid to El Salvador. Later, he hired me as the director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. He's been working for peace since his whole life. Met Dr. King in 1957, very involved in the struggle, as you well know, in every which way, and read the long biography we have in the program. After his lecture, we'll have time for question and answers. He'll be with us all weekend, speak on the panels. Tomorrow, speak again at Los Alamos on Sunday. So, dear friends, please stand and join me in giving a rousing, warm welcome to my friend, our friend and teacher and brother, Reverend Jim Lawson. Thank you very much. You're right here. You got a watch, you got water.
No, I've got a watch.
Huh?
Whose is this?
It's mine.
Okay.
You want me to put it away or you want to? Okay. Do whatever you want. The show's yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for your greeting, and John Deere for his introduction, and Kit for her opening presiding at this A very wonderful event, and this first event for Campaign Nonviolence. John Deere is, as you know, a very, very enthusiastic human being. I've never seen him otherwise. And it is true that we first met in federal jail in Los Angeles in 1980 when we were carrying on a campaign against the Reagan policies. And I have to stop that. It's not President Reagan's policy, it's President Reagan's administration. We citizens who want to be engaged have got to stop the political stuff of the powerful man or the redeeming man or the savior man or savior person in the White House. We've got to recognize that the White House and the administration is a vast institution. And there are all sorts of key players that we may know about, but there are all sorts of key players behind the scenes that no one knows about, least of all ordinary people like ourselves. Least of all ordinary people like ourselves. I'm sorry. I'll try to remember to do this, stay up close. So we really need to stop pretending that our society depends upon the right president. It's not true, sisters and brothers, and we have to get rid of that if we're going to change our society. We're going to create a culture. We have to create a culture of liberty where we are engaged. And I want to simply point out that there is a difference between the politics of an electoral society and the politics of nonviolence. We can examine that in many ways. I'm going off my notes now in my remarks, but all right, I'm starting that way anyway. And in any case, it's good to be here. And I'm grateful for John Deere and Ken and others and the CN for considering me and inviting me. And I look forward to being here now more than for almost a year or so, I guess. I want to not only thank them for inviting me, but I want to say to you how pleased I am that you are here. Some of the pieces of literature express the notion that we want to mainstream nonviolence. Well, good luck on that. However, I join you that nothing is more needed in our society than mainstreaming nonviolence, replacing the violence of our world, the violence of our own land with nonviolence. But you are preventing your insanity in a world that's going in many ways insane by putting your target on an impossible goal. And impossible goals can become possible if the people who lay the vision and set the strategy and the plans go at it in a fashion that allows it to become reality. You may or may not know that Gandhi, Mohandas K. Gandhi of India, who coined the term nonviolence, in South Africa around 1906, 1907, now, that's not in many of the books, but it's true, who coined the term nonviolence around 1906, 1907, and said that he spent some 50 years experimenting with nonviolence, considered nonviolence as, in his lifetime, the beginning of a social science on how you affect change, how you move society towards truth and beauty and justice and hope, how you make society more accessible to all human beings, excluding none. You may or may not know he was a pioneer in speaking against racism, calling for the equality of women, insisting that the development of modern society had to deal with the earth and the land and the people and the atmosphere. He was a pioneer in insisting that the empires of Western civilization had to decline so that the world's people could emerge and have the hope of organizing themselves the way they wanted to be organized for their betterment, for the improvement of their lives. He was a pioneer insisting that the village and the rural places of the nation of the earth ought to be equal partners in the advancement of the human family, and to ignore the people in the villages, in the rural areas, is to ignore the responsibility of stewardship for the earth and for all the people of the earth. He's an extraordinary pioneer. Now, we didn't hear any of this in the United States, especially in the 40s. Because we organized the Cold War. And we said, everyone who supports us in the Cold War is on God's side, and everyone who does not is on the side of evil, communism, socialism, anti-human, all the rest of it. So, when that campaign when Gandhi returned to India and caused that nation, that people, 350 million people, to organize their independence and separation from the British Empire without the forces of independence firing a single shot at any Britisher or at any Indian who was a part of the British Army. We really couldn't pay much attention to it. That was 1947 when it finally emerged. But it was unheard of. But we, in the West, paid no attention, because not only were we just coming out of World War II, but by 1947, the strings for the structures of the Cold War were already being woven into the fabric of our nation's life. And so we didn't know very much about Gandhi. He wasn't in our press. And then, about 10 years later, 1954 perhaps, having organized NATO, having organized the Cold War to isolate the then Soviet Union, having raised the whole policy and talking points of hostility for a sizable percentage of the world, the policy of the Cold War moved to Asia through a man by the name of John Foster Dulles, who was a Presbyterian elder, an international lawyer, and one of the people high up in the levels of economics in the nation and in the world. John Foster Dulles went to Pakistan and India to enlist them as the first countries in the Southeast Asia Treaty as a banner of armaments, the marginal line in Asia against the Soviet Union, because they were communist. And Gandhi was dead by this time, assassinated in 1948. But his right-hand disciple, in many ways, Jawaharlal Nehru, was Prime Minister of India, an Oxford graduate also, a lawyer. And Nehru, becoming the first Prime Minister, wanting to bring his country out of 200 or more years as a subject people to the British Empire wanted India to find its own way in a democratic fashion. And in Pakistan, they said, yes, we'll join you in the Cold War. Nehru said, no, the arguments between the Soviet Union and the United States is not the argument. The argument between the United States and the Soviet Union is not the only issue affecting humankind. And India will go its own way, will try to find another way to develop itself and to organize itself as a democracy, the largest democracy ever declared from the beginning of the formation of that nation as a free nation. So, of course, here in the United States, Gandhi, Nehru, India became enemies. So we did not do much thinking about Prime Minister Nehru, who was one of the finest intellectuals and finest politicians of the 20th century, one of the most learned men. So we know nothing about that period of time. But the point I'm making is that in the Western world, and in the United States in particular, we never, at the time that these men lived, understood Gandhi or nonviolence. So if there's going to be a national campaign of nonviolence, I think that we must not only use the resources that I know of and find myself a part of, from especially the life of Jesus of Nazareth, who I call the nonviolent athlete. We must also use and learn the resources of what Gandhi, in his initiation of the term, and how he tried to practice it across his life in campaign after campaign for breaking down systems of injustice and allowing space for the emergence of justice, the emergence of community on a new level in our world. So I welcome this occasion, but I want to say to you that Gandhi appreciates the vision of this campaign, because Gandhi insisted that nonviolence was a conception whose time had arrived. And he also insisted that if the world as led by Western civilization did not replace the politics of war with the politics of nonviolence, the human race could face extinction. He was a pioneer in recognizing that the event of nuclear weapon, nuclear power, explosive power, destructive power in the human race, gave the human race, for the first time, not only the power of war, but the power of self-suicide. So he insisted that this science of nonviolence must one day displace all forms of violence. And some people who have studied Gandhi back then said that what Gandhi represented was the coming alive of the great philosopher of America, William James's notion of the moral equivalent of war. That which could handle conflicts but change the nature of conflicts so that they could move towards peace and truth and the like. Well, having said that, and that's a different introduction from what I planned entirely. I want to just simply congratulate you again for what this CN represents. And then proceed from there. So point one that I'm making. That in the United States today there's more activism than we've ever known, than I've ever known. I lived through the 40s as a student and into the 50s, and people were very much unaware. We may not like the turmoil of Black Lives Matters or the turmoil around the Keystone Pipeline or the turmoil of those who, academics and others who are claiming that the economic inequality cannot last and must end. We may not like all of that. It may stress us out. But nevertheless, that represents, in at least my lifetime, that today there are millions and millions of people in the United States who are prepared to express their frustration, their anguish, their sense of vulnerability and the rest of it. And that much of this does represent the fact that people want change. People know that change is necessary. Millions of Americans, regardless of their status in life, are aware that our society is going the way of more war, of more corruption. We have all the money in the world to spend $3 trillion for the Iraq war, but no president since 1965 has funded the Head Start program, which began in 1965. The bill was passed in 65. No president has funded Head Start to put 4-year-olds together in social educational settings, and all of them of the nation. No president has funded that simple program 100%. And it's been used for cuts of the budget and for balancing the budgets everywhere. But $3 trillion for a war that has created more chaos than any of us in my generation can imagine. And Martin Luther King Jr. also said on April the 4th, 1967, that a nation that is spending more for military purposes is already a nation that is approaching moral bankruptcy, moral death. But there is more activism today on more issues. More people are connecting the dots than ever before. But it's my analysis over the last 10 to 20 years that it's not activism that matters. Activism for the sake of activism will take you nowhere. It has to be activism that becomes disciplined, that develops plans, that does heavy preparation. I think that has to have deep grounding in the history of nonviolence, especially in the 20th century, especially in one's own country. And that means to me deep grounding in the historical experiences of nonviolence in the United States itself as fundamental to helping activism move in the right direction. A favorite story of mine, a favorite story of my thinking and reading and study is the story of the Polish workers of Poland that became Solidarity. In 1970 began their assault to organize an independent union, failed. They got clobbered by the army. They were people who were committed to change of their land and of their own factory, the Gdansk shipyard. As they were licking their wounds after what seemed to be real defeat, several ordinary workers gathered and began to talk about the issue. And by this time, Gandhi had been translated into Polish language. Also, King had been translated into English, into Polish, the Slavic language. And some of them had begun reading some of that material that was available in their language. And they did not come out of that with a pessimistic mood. Instead, they said, we're going to start over. And this time, we will make certain that we follow our best understanding of nonviolent strategy, planning, thinking, and action. And we will resist all efforts to get us to move to little bits and pieces of violence that did us no good before, will do us no good now. And so in early 1980s, that 80s decade, solidarity took the shape that by 1988 resulted in an election in Poland where the Communist Party was defeated 8-1, which surprised everyone. The government, that was a single party government, was defeated 8-1. But they had to make the decision. We want change. We want better situation in the shipyards. We want working families to have better income. But they determined it cannot be done in a conventional way. It can only be done through nonviolence. And so I think the pressure of the first point I would like to make is this, that activism for the sake of activism is nevertheless a part of the status quo. Activism, to be effective in the United States, must become conscientiously, deliberately, and in the most disciplined fashion, an activism that is rooted and acts out of the best we know of nonviolent behavior strategy, tactics, methods, and the rest of it. Nothing less than that can create a nonviolent campaign or a nonviolent movement in this society that can shake our nation towards into a different direction from what it's taking today. That's a part of my thesis. It will not happen otherwise.
Keep speaking right into the microphone.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's my first point. And this second point I want to make is this. That I do not pretend that how my own life has been engaged is a consequence of my own sole effort. I am a product of fundamentally 8 decades of bending against injustice in my own land. Because it was age 4 that my pastor father was appointed to the Church of St. James AME Zion Church in Massillon, Ohio. I was 4. I will not forget that year, but that was the year also I began to wake up, become conscious, I guess. And I remember the day we moved into the parsonage on Tremont Street in Massillon. That's where I spent the first 20 years of my life, or the second 20 years of life, age 4. But in any case, it's on the streets of Massillon, Ohio, and in the parks of Massillon, Ohio, that for the first time I met the slurs of racism. usually from other youngsters like myself or somewhat older. And I won't go into a long story about that, but I will simply say to you that what that meant is, as I've looked back to that 4th year, what that meant was that I recognized I was in a fight for my life. Would I yield to the definition of Jim Lawson from my parents, from the church, from the love I experienced from birth, or would I yield to the animosity of the racism that I met? I understood none of it. But at age 9, it took on a different focus. Because in the 4th grade, the spring of my 4th year at Horseman Elementary School, I rushed home, met my mother at the back door into the kitchen, and after we had greeted, she said, "I have an errand for you, Jim." And she sent me uptown for that errand. On the way onto Main Street, or Lincoln Highway, which was also called, there was in this beautiful day, a car parked right on my right, and the windows were all open, and a youngster like myself had his head poking out of the car, standing in the front seat. And as I walked by, yelled at me the N-word. So I walked over to the child and slapped the child. I hit the boy, which was what I had started doing at age 4. Well, I'm mystified by some of this myself still. One shouldn't be mystified, but I remained that way. In any case, I finished the errand, ran on home, and sat in the favorite chair in the kitchen as my mother was still there, cooking, no doubt, our evening meal. And for the first time that I can remember, I told my mother what had happened on this incident of running this errand. And she didn't turn away from me. She didn't come and look at me or anything like that. She was on my left, her back to me. It was at a stove that was on the left. But I'll never forget the first words she spoke as she responded to my describing this incident. She said, "Jimmy, what good did that do?" And she went on with a long soliloquy, and I only remember bits and pieces of it, but she rehearsed our life as a family, our congregation, our Father, our God, our Dad's work, love of the family, and for me, that was all wonderful, critical experience. That had shaped my life at a very early age. Our congregation was a loving congregation. I remember that love and the rest of it. And then she ended it by saying, "Jimmy, there must be a better way." Now, there's a kind of a preface to that story, because my father and mother had a running quarrel over the 9 of us fighting each other or anybody else. And there were incidents where my father said to me, "You go out and fight that kid." And my mother saying, "Jacob, we should not let that happen." So there's that running affair which I've always remembered and great influence. But in any case, I made the decision then that never again on a playground, or in the park or the street, when I encountered such slurs, that I would never again strike out with my fists and my hostility. I didn't know, and began experimenting and practicing then, from then on, against racist slurs, calmness and coolness, find a way to respond on the playing field. I'm always an athlete by that time. Not getting into unnecessary fistfights, but walking away if I couldn't calm the situation down. Outplaying the opponents who wanted to play dirty. Outthinking them. Seeing if I can outfox them on the play field. By the time I reached high school, I was very aware that the way of love was a way of power. The way of love was a way of transformation. The way of love gave us an energy that if we practiced it, even in conflictive situations, we would be astonished at how those situations changed. And even when they didn't change, we would be astonished at the strengthening of character and life. The strengthening of the sense of one's own doing and being in the presence of eternity. And so it was 1947 then that I began to read Gandhi for myself and called what I was doing began to call what I was doing nonviolence. Was calling it out of youth conversations and out of student conversations. I was calling it pacifism. But I switched my term of myself to nonviolence as a nonviolent practitioner. So I want to say to us as clearly as I can that while I do not dismiss and while I continue to practice and study and reflect and meditate on the spiritual roots, the scriptural roots for me that are critical for nonviolence, if we want a nonviolent campaign, we must, in addition to those roots, in addition to reinterpreting what the scriptures have to say about violence, nonviolence, in addition to understanding Jesus as a nonviolent organizer, and there's great evidence of that in the four Gospels, in addition to that, we need to study the history of nonviolence itself and learn from it of how ordinary people across human history, not calling it nonviolence, faced conflict not with the mailed fist or the sword or the club, but faced it with nonviolent, what we can call nonviolent tactics. The first strike being 1170 BCE in Egypt, the first strike. Workers who stopped their work and called for new benefits and wages and the like. And if you do not know more about that, then read the Gene Sharp classic volume on the politics of nonviolence, where he has listed 194 tactics and methods of nonviolence used by all kinds of people across human history. I think that's the place where we, especially those of us who've come out of religious backgrounds, need to spend much of our time. Study that. Because if there's to be a nonviolent campaign in this country of a national character, of a local character, it has to be rooted in methods, tactics, principles that have been used in action. Gandhi at one place defined nonviolence as love in action, love in practice. Not love as principle, and not love as theory, but love as the energy that compels our behavior and compels the way we operate and work. So I want this to move me to the third major point that I'm making. John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis from Atlanta, calls me Jim Lawson the architect of the nonviolent movement of America. That's pretty heavy stuff. When he remarked this way in my presence some years ago now, I declined, but John insisted, and then pointed out to show me that what I did in my teaching in 1958, 59, 60 and beyond for Martin Luther King Jr., beginning in January of 1958, in Little Rock, Arkansas, in Baton Rouge, in Tallahassee, Florida, in Montgomery, Alabama, and Birmingham, Alabama, across that area, traveling as Southern Secretary for the Fellowship of Reconciliation. What I introduced as nonviolence, the way in which I presented it, laid the foundation for people to understand that there had to be a kind of a campaign that had in it discipline that was almost like a military action, but with a far more creative task and purpose and a far more complicated form of discipline, demanding of people far more than the boot camp ever demands. So I want to describe to you a little bit that movement, because I think it's the most essential movement in Western civilization that ever happened. So let me begin. The nonviolent movement of America. 1955, but I date it 1953 to 1973. 20 years. It never finished emerging into full maturity, and it never finished the work. We have to understand that probably in the society, any movement of great merit has to be a movement from generation to generation to generation to generation. We will not replace 400 years of the tyrannies of our own country with 1 or 2 years of campaigning. I put this on you now. I want you to understand what you're calling for in your vision. Will not happen. That campaign, 53 to 73. I can list each year various things that happened. Major campaigns, the startling numbers of actions across the country, of direct action, of people reorganizing for change in their localities. This research has not yet been completed. It's being done. But 1953 to 1973. And though it is not advertised in this 50th year of the voting rights campaign, it did shake and change the face of the United States. 1953 to 1973. We celebrate this year the 50th anniversary of the voting rights bill, Selma to Alabama. How many of you have seen Selma the movie? It's an important movie for anyone who wants nonviolence to look at. It has its problems, but it's an excellent movie. All right, the publicity on this 50th year, and I've read from the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, I've read essays and whatnot, and listened to television and talking about this, its 50th year, never talks about the fact that the voting rights bill could not have happened had it not been for the bus boycott of Montgomery, Alabama of 1955. Had it not been for the Tallahassee bus boycott of 56 and 57. It would not have happened had it not been for the Nashville campaign of 1960, which led us into the Freedom Ride campaign of 1961, with each one of these years adding immeasurable lessons to me personally and to the struggle that was emerging. 1962, the Albany movement. 1963, the Birmingham movement. 1964, the Mississippi Summer. I won't go through the whole list, but I'll say to you that 65 could not have happened in 55. It happened by the accumulative power that developed social consciousness and personal consciousness of millions of Americans, of the putting upon the agenda of the nation an agenda that had never been ignored, had always been ignored, and the tramping of many feet, the sitting in of many people, the kneel-ins, the prayer-ins, the wade-ins, the boycotts, the economic boycotts, the boycotts of the media, that literally thousands and thousands and thousands of people performed between 1953 and 1973. It took 10 years of work to make the Voting Rights Act of 1965 possible. Does that make sense? Media doesn't talk about direct action as nonviolent action. It talks usually about action as protests. It doesn't know how to write about these different campaigns. It's a protest. Well, protests for some of us who are schooled in this field is an important beginning place for nonviolence, but protests must emerge into non-cooperation, into intervention, into protracted struggle that almost becomes like a form of warfare. And I've lived through 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 of them in my own lifetime. Bus boycott of Montgomery lasted 381 days. Some 50,000 people. This is discipline. Some 50,000 people, most of whom had never heard the concept nonviolence. Stayed off the buses. Almost perfectly, as far as I've been able to learn. Almost perfectly. Imagine 50,000 people uniting in such a single purpose and a single target that we're going to change. And the important part of the bus boycott, Montgomery, it began to change the strategy of black people, of the NAACP, of political figures across the country about what the next steps for change were. The major approach from the black community had been desegregation of schools. The Montgomery bus boycott was actually pushed by women, black women, at least 2 years before the boycott ever happened. At least 2 years before December 1st, 1955. Rosa Parks was a part of that 2-year protest of the treatment of the bus in the buses. And what they were horrified by was how embarrassing, how venomous, what a shame it was to live in such segregated circumstances. They were more concerned about the dignity in which they were being, their dignity, and the fact that they were being daily mistreated. Black women, primarily, pushed the notion of a bus boycott in Montgomery. So the bus boycott did this. It told 99% of black people in our country and many white people of goodwill a simple thing. We must desegregate the United States. We must get rid of the public segregation. You cannot understand this because very few books are being written about it. There are some, and some very good ones. But the bus boycott said, the first issue is to get rid of this shameful segregation, which is not only tyranny and hypocritical, but it abuses our attempt as a nation to become a democratic society. It's an American tyranny, and we can never achieve access to all people, for all people, as long as it prevails. Now, Many of us, many Americans, think they were a part of that. But are you aware of the fact that how that movement changed our country is we don't have that many people of color in here, but this hotel would never have housed Dorothy and Jim Lawson not too many years ago. In my state of California, you had signs at places that said no Jew allowed, no chink allowed. In some places in New England, you had signs. The signs had no law behind them. They had the custom behind them. They had the culture that you're talking about. Change the culture of America. They had the culture that said that an owner of a store or a theater or a restaurant could put up a sign saying, no dirty Irish, no wetback, no wop, no Jap. These signs were in almost every state of the Union, some by custom, some by culture, some by law, always enforced by the police. And any person who complained would have to also probably expect the manager to call a police officer to support his right to exclude. Well, I'm simply saying to you there was a nonviolent movement of America. And I propose to you that you study that movement carefully. A lot of nonsense in some of the books. And I've learned as a student that how books easily can get things wrong. I can take you to a book that says that Jim Lawson is a Hindu mystic. But there are good books that are describing and increasingly being published these days about this matter. It is one of the most transforming movements for those of us who participated in it, as well as one of the most transforming movement for the United States. 65 celebrates the Voting Rights Acts, but I've already mentioned in 65 was passed the Head Start program. Now, I happen to think Head Start is a critical program. I happen to think that a society is not spending its highest amounts of money from its public budgets on its babies and children and young people is going to be a society that has a very questionable future, at best. So I think helping our children to get a good start as the Children's Defense Fund is one of the most important criteria for public budgets and for us. But these were not the only things. 1965 was also the passage of the first Immigration Reform Act in the United States and signed by President Johnson that began the process of de-racializing immigration in the United States. Up until 65, if you lived in England or even Poland, you could easily get a visa to visit the United States. But if you lived in China or South Africa, you could not. This is part of the racist system of our country. The 65 Immigration Act gave each nation in the world a very limited numbers of spots where people could apply for different kinds of visas into the United States. This is, of course, apart from what capitalism, a business community has done, and it continues to do. Not only is this true of 1965 as a consequence of the tramping feet, but in 1965, President Johnson and the Congress And Adam Clayton Powell, a black congressman from Harlem of New York, determined that that was the time, in the midst of the movement, to pass Medicare. I don't know if you know this. It was also the time where President Johnson is responding to the movement by the Great Society notions, pushed billions of dollars into the federal budget in order to allow churches, individuals, nonprofit organizations, county and city governments, villages, to have money to provide for affordable housing in their areas on their way, to do it themselves. Now, obviously, that's a critical program. We have heavy homelessness in Los Angeles. Almost all of it is because of the lack of housing. Some mental illness, yes, but most of it is because housing is increasingly unaffordable for people who work. Because the 1980 administration of Ronald Reagan cut affordable housing budgets out of the federal dollar. I want to push hard in this business of government because if we're going to have government of democracy, affordable housing and the poverty program were programs that said money can be available for local groups where they are, if they do the thinking, the research, the planning, and the strategy that provides for solving the problems they see where they live. Now, what better use of public money in the federal government than to spread it across the country for all kinds of citizens groups to use in their own sight for the ways that they want to see the improvement of their own community? We who know that our society can be different must demand that such programs become a part of the way that governments, local, statewide, and national, operate. Giving us, ordinary people where we live, the opportunity to work in our locality for the things that we know that are needed for others as well as for ourselves. So that program, that nonviolent campaign, 20 years that I've listed without describing, set the chart. And let me conclude by telling you what, therefore, is necessary. I do not believe you can have a national campaign from the top down. As CN is doing it, national campaigns, if we're going to have the campaign that we need in the 21st century, or the campaigns must be rooted in the local community. Must be rooted in the local community. And I maintain that local communities must root their campaigns in issues of injustice that they see where they are. Now, the young people who are organizing around Black Lives Matters have put that agenda in the discussion plates in very many places, though some areas of the country seem to be completely immune to it. But I ask you the question, should we have law enforcement programs that permit and justify the shooting of an unarmed resident? In Ferguson, Missouri, the police officer Wilson, who did the shooting of Michael Brown, testified before the grand jury that he became fearful because he saw charging after him a demon, charging towards him, rather, a demon. Should we have public servants of our society who see another human being as a demon instead of as a human being? If we're going to have democracy, that is. I would suggest to you, to some of you in your local community, that maybe the place where your action ought to take place is getting into this issue of the police killings of ordinary people of all kinds. And they kill people. This is not something that is new to me. I have read and studied this matter for a number of years in organized groups in Memphis and in Los Angeles on this issue. In some of the collection of the data of the killings of unarmed people, we have killed from age 13 to age 79. Tamara Rice in Cleveland was 12 years old, so that lowers the age group to 12 to 79. As I have taught nonviolence, I have not centered my attention on war. For war is an extension of the culture of Western civilization. I have centered my efforts about nonviolence on domestic violence, on violence in our own society, whatever it is, and how many different kinds of it. I've centered my attention on structural violence, systemic violence. The media keeps us alarmed most of the time about every day a single piece of violence against someone who was killed. But the poverty of violence, which is the worst form of torture, the poverty of a lack of hospitality in the United States kills 80 babies a day right now who die in the first year of their lives because they are not surrounded with a healthy start. 80 a day. I focus on that violence, systemic violence. The pediatricians tell us that it is a public health problem that we could wipe out in America in a minimum of 5 to 10 years if we wanted to stop it. That's the violence that we need to be focusing on. If we're going to change the violence of war, we must change the violence of injustice and cruelty in the United States itself. So I say, study that movement in America, the American nonviolent movement of America, 1953 to 1973, as a way of understanding the issues we face, but more than that, discipline and tactics and methods that can be used. And then the final point I want to make is this, that much of the turmoil in our society is because all sorts of decent people are acting out of the complicated history of our nation. That is one of the most complicated histories I think I know of, though I don't know that much about world history. Because from the beginning, almost, we have put violence into place as we moved into this land that we call the United States. From the killing of Mary Dyer, who was a Quaker who lived in the Massachusetts colony and who was told she could not live in the colony as long as she was a practicing Quaker. And Mary Dyer replied that I'm going to follow my conscience. It is a conscience formed by God also. And the fourth time she returned to the colony, they hung her. in the Boston Commons. There's a statue of her in Boston in that Commons where she was hung. The first massacre of native people was in what is now Mystic, Connecticut, in the year 1636 or 37. Some 700 men, women, and children were slaughtered by a contingency of soldiers from the Puritan colony, Massachusetts. Early in the settlement of this country, when women became independent in their communities, a number of them were called witches and were hung. You know that story. New books have been written recently about this. So violence, almost from the beginning, a spiritual violence that called the Indian less than human, but the physical violence heaped upon indigenous people as well as upon settlers themselves. To this was added the violence of slavery. It's estimated by some historians that 10 million people lost their lives in the slave trade across from Africa to our Atlantic shores. Some 10 million people lost their lives. African historians say that some 30 to 60 million people were killed in the conquest of Africa by Western civilization in those years. So I point steadily to the violence in our own society that we must correct. Most people are influenced by these four pulling together of institutional tyranny in our nation. Ideological tyranny, that is, that some people don't matter, but institutional tyranny and violence. These are racism, sexism, violence, and plantation capitalism. These are the four historic streams that have shaped modern America more than our idealism. These are the four streams that have had us create so much violence in the 20th century. These are the four streams that convince power structure people that they can own Iraq or Afghanistan or Pakistan or the Congo. So if we're going to change the culture, which is essential, we must mobilize the wisdom of the history of nonviolence. And that history must mean deep preparation for all who want to participate. Deep preparation, not training. I used that term myself in the 60s, but I prefer the term deep preparation. It must include tactics and strategies of how you plan, and it must lodge itself in the local community. We do need nonviolent campaigns in the United States that will put all the past campaigns and the ones of the 20th century that will surpass all of those past campaigns. There is no way that our land can move away from war, its violence, its cruelty, its injustice, without we the people using our concern for ourselves and our country and for other people, use that concern. And so while I chuckle that you have adopted such a commitment, mainstreaming nonviolence, and while I wish you well, and while I will watch you well, and will be supportive in various ways I can, remember this, that may very well be that the future of this nation, the future of the experiment that says that all are created equal and that we can have a society of equality, liberty, and justice for all, may depend upon what we do through nonviolent struggle. I wish you good luck.